On a frozen night along the Western Front, German soldiers believed darkness was their final advantage. The trenches were quiet, the sky moonless, and the battlefield nearly invisible. But in a single shattering moment, the Americans erased the night. Flares roared upward, artillery illumination burst overhead, and the ground glowed like daylight. Shock spread through the German line. If you want more powerful WW2 stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Night had always been a defining element of warfare on the Western Front. By late 1944 and early 1945, German units were increasingly forced to operate under darkness, using the cover of night to move ammunition, reposition artillery, and avoid the growing reach of American airpower. Darkness gave them a thin margin of safety, a shield against the overwhelming firepower that dominated daylight hours. When the sun was up, German troops knew that every road, ridge, and tree line could be observed, targeted, or bombed. But at night, the battlefield belonged to them, at least, they believed it did. German doctrine had long incorporated night operations as a core asset. Throughout the war, German infantry had relied on darkness for infiltration and retreat. Officers encouraged movements between dusk and dawn, when Allied aircraft could no longer track them and American artillery had fewer precise aiming reference points. Under a moonless sky, German units could shift positions with relative confidence. They could evacuate wounded, reinforce collapsing segments of the line, or assemble counterattack forces without drawing attention. This confidence grew even stronger during the harsh winter months, when fog, cloud cover, and early sunsets turned the battlefield into a maze of shadows. Reports from German field commanders described the night as a temporary equalizer, a brief moment when American aerial dominance seemed to disappear. Soldiers joked that the only safe hour left in the war was the hour after midnight, when the sky was too dark for the ever-present American reconnaissance planes. But American commanders understood this pattern well. By the second half of the war, they recognized that the Germans were relying on darkness as their final refuge, a tactical shelter that allowed them to delay collapse, rebuild defensive lines, and preserve dwindling reserves. To counter this, the U.S. Army and Army Air Forces invested heavily in illumination tactics. These included star shells fired by artillery batteries, signal flares launched from infantry positions, and high-intensity aerial illumination dropped by bombers. None of it was experimental. All of it was real, tested, and used across multiple fronts. The effectiveness of these tactics had already been proven during earlier operations in North Africa and Italy. In Sicily, American units had used star shells to expose German movement across hillsides. In Italy, flares had turned nighttime river crossings into bright, chaotic battlegrounds. By the time U.S. forces pushed into France, illumination warfare had become a refined art, one that allowed American troops to dominate even when the sun was gone. On the German side, rumors spread about these new American abilities. Soldiers reported nights that suddenly erupted into blinding light. Others spoke of entire valleys illuminated as if by a full moon, even though the sky had been pitch black only moments earlier. The psychological effect was undeniable. Many troops who relied on darkness felt disoriented, exposed, and vulnerable the moment the night disappeared. Meanwhile, American commanders prepared for larger, more coordinated uses of illumination. They understood that if they could remove darkness entirely, even for a few minutes, it would break the rhythm of German operations. Surveillance could continue. Artillery could fire accurately. Infantry could advance with confidence. And the enemy would lose the one advantage they believed they still controlled. By late 1944, as the front line stretched through forests, towns, and frozen fields, American units began to carry more illumination rounds, flares, and star shells than ever before. Some artillery battalions allocated up to 20% of their ammunition loads to light-producing ordnance. Commanders coordinated timing between flare drops and artillery illumination to create near-continuous visibility over targeted sectors. German soldiers noticed the change. Reports detailed nights where the sky seemed brighter than it had any right to be. Patrol leaders complained that the Americans were erasing the shadows. Machine gun crews found themselves suddenly highlighted by brilliant arcs of light. The very concept of night, once a dependable shield, was becoming unreliable. This growing shift set the stage for the moment when America would use these tactics not merely to disrupt German movement, but to shock an entire defensive line. A moment when the night, long trusted by German troops, would vanish in an instant. And that moment was drawing closer. The moment when America would erase the night did not come from a single weapon, unit, or idea. It emerged from a combination of necessity, innovation, and battlefield experience gathered over years of fighting across continents. By late 1944, American commanders had learned that night operations were no longer optional, they were essential for maintaining pressure on an enemy that fought hardest when hidden by darkness. The terrain of western Germany and eastern France shaped much of this shift. Dense forests, rolling fields, narrow roads, and shattered towns formed a battlefield where shadows stretched for hundreds of yards and valleys stayed black even under starlight. German forces used these natural features to reposition themselves, hide supply columns, bury artillery pieces beneath tree cover, and slip away before dawn. Every night allowed them to buy more time. The Americans quickly adapted. Engineers began building forward observation posts with improved signal coordination. Artillery units refined their timing so that illumination rounds could be fired in rhythm, overlapping their burn time to create a sequence of light pulses. Air support crews trained to drop flares at precise altitudes to maximize coverage. The U.S. infantry divisions operating along the front were instructed to treat light not only as a tool for visibility but as a weapon of disruption. If the night was the Germans' shield, then illumination would be the hammer to break it. The Germans, however, believed their night strategies still held. Reports from the Wehrmacht's defensive sectors in late 1944 described American units as hesitant at night, operating cautiously after sundown and limiting movement across exposed terrain. German commanders noted that while American artillery was relentless during daylight, the barrage softened at night as visibility declined. They assumed this pattern would continue indefinitely, even as the Americans were preparing something entirely different. The critical buildup took place quietly. In supply depots behind the lines, crates of artillery illumination rounds, some containing magnesium-based compositions that burned with searing brightness, were stacked in increasing numbers. Airfields received shipments of parachute flares designed to drift slowly, lighting the ground for up to a full minute at a time. Searchlights, battery-powered and vehicle-mounted, were assigned to specific regiments for coordinated operations. Everything was prepared with a precise purpose: to deny the Germans the night. This planning was not theoretical. American commanders had studied how light shaped combat psychology. Reports from Italy described German units freezing in place when suddenly illuminated. In Normandy, some German soldiers abandoned positions when flares turned their trenches into exposed silhouettes. Darkness offered safety, light meant vulnerability. And if used correctly, illumination could fracture the enemy's sense of security before a single shot was fired. The location chosen for the largest application of this tactic was a sector of the Western Front where the German line had grown increasingly dependent on night relief operations. Intelligence indicated that several German companies rotated through the area after sunset, bringing ammunition forward and withdrawing casualties. The Americans recognized this pattern as an opportunity. If they could strip the darkness away at the right moment, they could trap an entire rotation cycle in the open. To prepare for this, reconnaissance aircraft conducted nighttime overflights to map German paths and estimate their typical movement windows. Artillery batteries plotted coordinates for both illumination and high-explosive shells. Infantry units rehearsed advancing under artificial light, practicing how to navigate shadows created by flares drifting overhead. Every component of the operation was timed to the second. The Germans sensed tension building along the line but misinterpreted its cause. They believed the Americans were preparing another daylight offensive, not a nighttime one. German field reports during this period mentioned increased American activity before dusk but assumed it was routine. Even experienced officers dismissed early flare usage as mere harassment, not realizing it was part of something far larger. The Americans had one final advantage: weather. A series of cold, clear nights stretched across the region, offering perfect conditions for illumination weapons. No fog to smother the glow. No wind to scatter drifting flares. The sky itself became a silent ally. With plans complete, artillery readied, and air support waiting for the signal, the Americans prepared to unleash a display of light unlike anything German soldiers along that sector had ever experienced. The night would not just be illuminated, it would be erased. And the moment to trigger it was approaching rapidly. The plan to erase the night was more than a display of brightness, it was a tactical system designed to break German defenses with precision. Every flare, every illumination round, and every shifting shadow had a purpose. The Americans understood that light alone was not enough, it had to be controlled, sequenced, and weaponized to create an environment where their troops could move freely while the enemy stood exposed and uncertain. At the center of this approach were the artillery units positioned miles behind the front. These battalions were equipped with illumination shells fitted with parachutes, burning at intensities capable of turning entire ridgelines into glowing silhouettes. But the brilliance of the tactic lay not in the shells themselves, but in the timing. American gunners didn't fire them all at once. They fired them in intervals, each round igniting just as the previous one began to fade. This created an unbroken curtain of light that prevented German eyes from adjusting back to darkness. Infantry commanders took full advantage of this effect. Under normal night conditions, soldiers moved cautiously, stepping quietly to avoid drawing attention. But when the night was lit up as bright as early morning, American units advanced with confidence. German trenches that had been invisible moments earlier now lay outlined in stark clarity, carved into the earth like maps. Machine gun nests, anti-tank positions, and camouflaged dugouts lost their concealment. The darkness that once protected them dissolved under a flood of magnesium glare. Meanwhile, searchlight teams positioned along the rear slopes of nearby hills prepared to widen the illumination even further. These were not the massive anti-aircraft searchlights used early in the war, but smaller, more maneuverable units designed for ground operations. When activated, they swept across fields and tree lines, expanding visibility beyond the reach of the descending flares. The beams worked like silent sentinels, catching movement instantly and forcing German troops to freeze rather than risk being seen. American rifle companies trained specifically for these illuminated advances. Soldiers understood how to read shadows, a skill crucial in this kind of tactical environment. They knew how to move between bright patches and darker fringes, using the contrast to disguise their approach. While the Germans struggled to adapt to the sudden glare, the Americans used it to navigate the terrain with surprising speed. German forces, on the other hand, were caught in a trap of conflicting instincts. Some soldiers tried to run for cover the moment the light hit them, their shadows stretching across the ground like long dark warnings. Others crouched in place, unsure whether movement would expose them further. Communication collapsed quickly, flare-bright skies made signal flares difficult to read, and radio operators hesitated to transmit for fear of drawing artillery fire. What made the tactic even more effective was that the Americans were not simply illuminating the battlefield, they were studying it. Every shift, every shadow, every movement became a source of intelligence. Machine gun teams identified targets instantly. Mortar crews adjusted their fire with pinpoint accuracy. Forward observers, working under constant artificial daylight, sent corrections faster than at any previous point in the campaign. This was illumination warfare executed with precision, coordination, and purpose. It was not chaos. It was calculated control, an operation designed to overpower the German reliance on darkness and replace it with an environment where American dominance was absolute. And this tactical mastery would form the foundation for what came next, the moment when illumination would transform from tool to turning point, marking the beginning of a decisive shift in the night battle. The effectiveness of the American illumination strike did not come from brightness alone, it came from the technology behind it. Every flare, every parachute light, every star shell carried years of refinement, experimentation, and battlefield adaptation. By 1944, U.S. forces possessed some of the most reliable and powerful illumination equipment used by any army in World War II. These tools were not improvised. They were engineered for dominance. The magnesium-based parachute flares, for instance, were designed to burn at intensities exceeding 2 million candle power. When released from aircraft or fired from specialized mortars, they drifted slowly, suspended by canvas parachutes that resisted wind and maintained altitude. A single flare could illuminate hundreds of meters of terrain, enough to expose entire companies of German infantry who had expected to remain hidden behind the veil of night. Artillery illumination rounds carried their own advantages. Fitted with timed fuses and thin casings, they burst at precise altitudes, releasing blinding light that cascaded downward in widening circles. American gunners had mastered these timing sequences. They learned how to align each burst so that one flare's fading light was overtaken by the rise of another, forcing German soldiers to endure an unbroken glare that overwhelmed their night-trained eyes. But the brilliance of American technology was matched by an equally powerful psychological component. The Germans had spent years relying on darkness as a tactical refuge. Their training emphasized nighttime movement, nighttime ambushes, nighttime reconnaissance. When the night vanished, their doctrine weakened. Their confidence wavered. The terrain they thought they understood changed into an exposed landscape where every mistake could be seen, targeted, and punished. For many German soldiers, the shock was immediate. Human vision adapts to darkness gradually, and sudden light disorients even experienced troops. When the flares burst overhead, pupils contracted sharply, causing momentary blindness. Depth perception vanished. Shadows stretched at unnatural angles. Soldiers who had been navigating confidently in darkness suddenly felt unsteady, as though the ground itself had shifted. In those critical seconds of disorientation, American units seized the advantage. Meanwhile, the Americans experienced the opposite effect. They had rehearsed under bright illumination. Their equipment, from M1 rifles to mortar sights, functioned reliably in changing light. Their forward observers were trained to read terrain under flare-lit skies. Instead of confusion, they experienced clarity. Instead of panic, they acted with purpose. The psychological balance of the battlefield flipped instantly. The technological gap deepened the German sense of helplessness. Few German units possessed effective countermeasures. Their flares burned shorter and dimmer. Their searchlights were rare, fuel-hungry, and difficult to reposition. Their night optics were limited to small, experimental units that saw little frontline use. Against American illumination, they had almost nothing to respond with except discipline, and discipline faltered under relentless light. As flares continued to descend and searchlights swept the battlefield, German soldiers began to understand the truth: the Americans were not simply lighting the night. They were rewriting the terms of combat. Darkness no longer provided safety. Movement no longer concealed risk. The psychological terrain had shifted completely. The night itself no longer belonged to Germany. And this new reality would become devastatingly clear in the moment that followed, the moment when all the planning, all the preparation, and all the technology converged into one decisive turning point. The transformation of the battlefield, the slow erasure of the night, set the stage for the moment American commanders had been preparing for. Everything up to this point had been deliberate: the reconnaissance flights, the artillery rehearsals, the study of German movement schedules, the placement of searchlights, the stockpiling of illumination rounds. Now, those pieces were aligned. The Americans were ready to strike at the exact moment when the German line would be most vulnerable, most exposed, and least prepared to adapt. Intelligence reports indicated that a German relief column would be moving shortly after midnight. Ammunition carriers, stretcher teams, and small reserve units used the same narrow forest road each night to rotate personnel. Under normal conditions, they moved efficiently through the dark, their boots muffled by frost-hardened soil, their silhouettes blending into the tree-line. American scouts observed these patterns without interference, taking careful note of timing down to the minute. The Germans believed this nightly routine remained invisible. In truth, it had been carefully mapped. American artillery observers positioned themselves on a low ridge overlooking the corridor. They lay silent in their cold-weather gear, compasses and plotting boards arranged beneath camouflage nets. Farther behind them, concealed in tree lines and shallow dugouts, infantry companies waited for the signal. Some soldiers tightened the straps of their helmets, others checked rifle magazines or adjusted mortar sights. They knew what was coming. They knew the night would soon shift in their favor. In the distance, German lanterns flickered like fireflies, small groups beginning their nightly movements. These faint glows were enough for the Americans to confirm the operation was unfolding on schedule. Once the Germans stepped fully into the open, the Americans would unleash the opening stage of the illumination strike, a coordinated pattern that would trap the enemy in a sudden, unnatural daylight. The order moved quietly down the American line. Radio operators relayed coded instructions. Artillery crews leaned over their guns, adjusting elevation and fuse settings with rehearsed precision. Gun commanders verified the sequence: illumination rounds first, spaced at timed intervals, followed by smoke markers for forward observers, then high-explosive shells once visibility was fully established. A heavy silence settled over the landscape. The moonless sky hung still, the cold night air carrying every distant crunch of boots and equipment. German forces continued their slow march, unaware that they were stepping into a carefully constructed window of vulnerability. The Americans held their breath, waiting for the exact moment when the enemy would be fully committed to the road. And then, at the precise second plotted days earlier, an American officer raised his arm. The signal was given. The night was about to end. The first illumination round burst high above the treetops with a crack that rolled across the valley like distant thunder. For a fraction of a second, the darkness held its shape. Then the flare bloomed, an expanding white fire suspended beneath a drifting parachute. Shadows evaporated. The forest road glowed as if a hidden sun had risen directly overhead. German soldiers halted instantly. Some shielded their eyes. Others froze in disbelief. The night they depended on, the night they trusted, was gone. The second flare burst before the first had even begun to fade. Then a third. Then a fourth. Each explosion added another layer of brightness, turning the entire landscape into a washed-out field of harsh, silver light. The German relief column, caught in the center of the corridor, was now fully exposed. Every movement was visible. Every silhouette stood outlined against snow and soil. American forward observers sprang into action. With the terrain illuminated like early morning, they relayed target corrections with precision. Artillery batteries miles away responded instantly. High-explosive shells whistled overhead, their timing synchronized with the illumination sequence to ensure the battlefield never returned to darkness. The first explosion struck the forest road in sharp, punishing bursts. Trees shattered, dirt erupted, and the once quiet path transformed into a corridor of fire. German soldiers attempted to scatter, but the light betrayed every direction they ran. Even those who tried to hide behind trees found their shadows stretching across the ground like arrows pointing toward their positions. Searchlights joined the assault moments later. American crews swung their beams across the battlefield, locking them on clusters of movement. Each sweep immobilized German troops who instinctively crouched or dropped flat, knowing the light would guide incoming fire. In the glare, helmets gleamed like markers. Rifles reflected thin slashes of brightness. There was no longer any place to disappear. American infantry advanced with steady coordination. They moved through flare-lit terrain they had rehearsed navigating for weeks. Their boots crunched over frozen soil, their outlines merging with the shifting shadows cast by drifting parachutes and searchlight beams. Mortar teams set up quickly, firing at targets forward observers identified with stunning accuracy. The German response collapsed almost immediately. Radios crackled with fragmented calls for assistance, but communication was nearly impossible under the sensory shock of constant illumination. Officers shouted orders, but the roar of artillery drowned their voices. Some troops attempted to form defensive positions, but each time they gathered, the searchlights found them, pinning them down like insects under glass. What struck the Germans hardest was not the violence, it was the visibility. They were trained to fight in darkness, to slip through shadows, to rely on the night as an ally. Now that ally had abandoned them. The sudden brightness felt unnatural, overwhelming, disorienting. It stripped away control, leaving them exposed not only to American firepower but also to the terrifying realization that the battlefield no longer obeyed the rules they understood. As more flares drifted down and the landscape glowed brighter than dawn, the Americans pushed deeper, seizing positions along the forest road. German units broke apart under the intensity of the attack, stumbling through light they could neither escape nor counter. The moment had arrived when the night ceased to be a refuge, and the Germans understood, too late, that the Americans had mastered a domain they once believed untouchable. And as the last illumination flare descended, its glare washing across the shattered corridor, the balance of the night battle had changed forever. When the final flare hissed out and the battlefield returned to its natural darkness, the silence felt hollow, emptied of certainty, stripped of the confidence German soldiers once held in the night. The smoke drifted upward in thin, wavering columns, illuminated only by the faint embers of burning tree trunks and scattered equipment. The contrast was staggering. Moments earlier, the terrain had glowed like midday. Now it was a quiet, fractured wasteland marked by the consequences of a single, decisive tactic. American infantry moved slowly through the corridor, clearing the area with methodical precision. Their movements were steady, deliberate, shaped by a discipline forged through months of hard fighting. They checked bodies, collected prisoners, and documented positions. Behind them, medics tended to wounded soldiers, both American and German, under headlamps shielded to preserve the darkness. Even in the aftermath of dominance, there was procedure, order, and purpose. For the German units caught in the strike, the shock lingered long after the last flare fell. Captured soldiers spoke of the unbearable brightness, the disorientation, the sense that the world had changed in an instant. Some described the experience as stepping from night into fire. Others recalled the overwhelming feeling that every movement, every attempt at survival, had been watched from above. Their accounts carried the psychological weight of a force realizing that darkness, once their most trusted ally, could no longer protect them. American officers recognized this shift immediately. Reports filed after the operation noted a measurable decline in German nighttime mobility along several segments of the front. Units that previously rotated confidently under darkness became hesitant, spacing their movements irregularly or canceling them entirely. Patrols diminished. Morale fractured. German soldiers began to fear the very hours they once depended on. The Americans, by contrast, gained a new level of confidence. The success of the Illumination strike reinforced their belief that initiative belonged to those who controlled visibility, day or night. Artillery commanders refined their illumination timings. Infantry leaders adjusted their night doctrine, incorporating lessons from the operation. Air support units increased their flare-carrying capacity. What had once been a supporting tactic evolved into a core strategic asset. In broader terms, the aftermath marked a decisive psychological transition in the Western Front's winter fighting. For months, German commanders had relied on nighttime movement to compensate for shortages in manpower, fuel, and air cover. The Americans shattered that pattern in a single night. The message was unmistakable: there was no longer a corner of the battlefield, no hour of the clock, no stretch of darkness where the enemy could feel secure. And the effects traveled far beyond this one forest corridor. Reports from other sectors soon described German forces using fewer night convoys, altering supply runs, and repositioning artillery earlier in the evening. Every change, every adjustment, revealed a shared fear that the Americans might once again erase the night without warning. Yet amid the tactical and psychological consequences, there was also a deeper reflection. Warfare had entered a stage where technology could reshape not only the battlefield but the fundamental nature of time itself. Night was no longer a fixed environment. Daylight was no longer bound to the sun. The Americans had demonstrated that with coordination, planning, and innovation, they could manipulate the battlefield in ways that defied old doctrines. And this shift carried implications for the remainder of the war. For the soldiers who witnessed it, the memory endured. Some remembered the sudden brilliance, others the strange clarity of a forest glowing like dawn, and many recalled the unsettling feeling of watching the enemy stripped of their final refuge. It was a reminder that dominance did not come from a single weapon, but from the ability to adapt faster, prepare better, and act decisively when the moment arrived. In the end, the night that had once protected Germany became the night that revealed their vulnerability. And for the Americans, it became a symbol of rising capability, a demonstration that even the darkness itself could be turned into an instrument of victory.